In the heart of a blinding blizzard, a golden retriever shivers as she curls protectively around her 5 newborn puppies. Stranded on a deserted trail, her only hope is for someone to hear her desperate barks before the freezing cold claims them all. As the snow piles higher and the storm rages on, will help arrive in time, or will their cries for help fade into the icy wilderness forever? The snowstorm rolled in faster than anyone had predicted. What had started as a gentle snowfall in the early hours of the morning quickly turned into a full-fledged blizzard. The wind howled through the frozen wilderness, tearing at the trees and sending snowflakes spinning in chaotic swirls. Visibility was nearly zero, the world blanketed in a suffocating wall of white. In the middle of this icy wasteland, a golden retriever struggled against the biting wind. Her fur, once a vibrant golden hue, was now matted with ice and dirt. Her body trembled violently, but she pressed on, her instincts driving her forward. Behind her, nestled in a shallow ditch partially shielded by a fallen tree, were 5 tiny puppies. Lucy, though she no longer had a name to call her own, was exhausted. Her legs ached with every step, and her paws were raw from the jagged ice and frozen ground. She had been wandering for days, abandoned in the cold after her owner had decided she was no longer worth the effort. She had given birth only a week earlier, and the strain of finding food while nursing her litter had taken a toll on her. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Her puppies were counting on her. The puppies whimpered softly, their fragile bodies huddled together for warmth. The storm was merciless, and the thin blanket of snow-covered branches Lucy had found for them offered little protection. She nosed at them gently, her breath creating small puffs of steam in the frigid air. It wasn't enough. The biting cold seeped into Lucy's bones, and she knew her time was running out. If she couldn't find shelter or help soon, her puppies wouldn't make it through the night. She stood, shaking the snow off her fur, and barked, a desperate, hoarse sound that was quickly swallowed by the howling wind. She looked back at her puppies, her heart aching as she saw their tiny bodies shivering. The oldest, a little boy with a patch of white on his chest, nudged his siblings closer together. Even in their vulnerability, they clung to each other, a tiny family trying to survive against impossible odds. Lucy licked each of them, her touch gentle but urgent, as if to tell them to hold on. Then, with one last glance, she turned and trudged back into the storm. She couldn't stay still. There had to be something out there, someone who would hear her cries for help. The hours stretched on, the storm only growing fiercer. Lucy's bark grew weaker, her voice hoarse from calling out into the void. Snow clung to her fur, weighing her down, but she kept moving, her instincts screaming at her to keep going. Her paws bled, leaving faint red smears in the snow that were quickly covered by the relentless blizzard. Her mind wandered to the days before. She had once been part of a family, loved and cared for. She remembered warm fires, a soft bed, and hands that scratched behind her ears. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. When she had gotten pregnant, her owner's attitude had changed. The once affectionate pats became indifferent shoves, and her food portions grew smaller. By the time her puppies were born, she was seen as a burden. The memory of being shoved out of a moving car was still fresh in her mind. The car had barely stopped, the door flung open long enough to throw her and her tiny litter out onto the frozen ground. She had chased after it, barking and crying, but the car disappeared into the distance, leaving her and her puppies alone in the freezing cold. She had fought to keep them alive since then, scavenging for scraps and finding makeshift shelters. But this storm was different. It was unforgiving, and Lucy knew it was a fight she couldn't win alone. Her ears perked up suddenly as a faint sound cut through the wind. Was it footsteps? Her heart leapt, and she barked again, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She strained her ears, but the sound was gone, replaced by the relentless roar of the wind. Back at the ditch, the puppies cried softly. Their tiny bodies were losing heat fast, their mother's absence leaving them vulnerable. The smallest of the litter, a runt with a patchy golden coat, barely moved, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Lucy returned, carrying a frozen twig in her mouth. A pitiful attempt to bring something back to her babies. She lay down beside them, wrapping her body around them as tightly as she could. Her warmth was all she had left to give. She closed her eyes, praying in her own way for a miracle. As the storm raged on, a figure moved in the distance. Mark, a middle-aged railway worker, was trudging along the tracks, inspecting them for any damage before the next train came through. His job often required him to brave harsh conditions, but tonight's storm was particularly brutal. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face, squinting against the wind. A faint sound reached his ears, a bark, weak and desperate. He stopped, turning his head toward the sound. It was barely audible over the storm, but it was there. He frowned, his breath visible in the icy air. "Is that a dog?" he muttered to himself. He hesitated. The storm was worsening, and he still had miles of track to inspect. But something about the sound tugged at him. He knew these tracks well. There was nothing out here except wilderness. If there was a dog out in this weather, it wouldn't survive long. Mark adjusted his flashlight, the beam cutting through the snow, and began walking toward the sound. Lucy lifted her head weakly, her ears perking up as she heard footsteps. Her heart raced, a mix of hope and fear. She barked again, her voice a hoarse whisper, but it was enough. Mark's flashlight caught her eyes, reflecting in the darkness. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight before him. A golden retriever, half buried in snow, with 5 tiny puppies huddled beside her. "Oh my God," he whispered, his heart breaking at the sight. He crouched down, reaching out a gloved hand. "Hey girl. It's okay. I'm here to help," Lucy whimpered, her body trembling as she pushed her puppies closer to him, as if pleading with him to save them. Mark knew he had to act fast. The puppies were barely moving, their tiny bodies limp from the cold. He shrugged off his thick jacket, wrapping it around them as best he could. "You're a brave girl," he said softly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I've got you now." As the snow continued to fall, Mark realized he had a long, difficult journey ahead. But he was determined. He wasn't going to let this family become another tragedy of the storm. The blizzard had shown no signs of letting up, and Mark cursed under his breath as the snow piled higher around his boots. Every step was a struggle, the icy wind slicing through his heavy coat like a blade. His flashlight beam flickered, fighting against the storm's wrath, but he pressed on, driven by the faint hope that he hadn't imagined the barking he'd heard earlier. "Just a few more minutes," he muttered to himself, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to convince. Mark had been a railway worker for over 15 years, patrolling these tracks in all kinds of weather, but tonight felt different. The storm wasn't the only thing weighing on him. There was a gnawing sense of urgency, a gut feeling he couldn't shake. He thought of the barking, weak, desperate, and so out of place in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, he stopped. There it was again. Faint, but unmistakable. A bark. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the sound. He adjusted his flashlight, the beam barely penetrating the swirling snow. He moved faster now, his legs burning as he trudged through the drifts. The barking grew louder, more insistent, and then he saw it. A small, huddled figure just off the tracks. At first, he thought it was a pile of snow-covered debris. But as he got closer, the shape shifted, and 2 glowing eyes reflected the beam of his flashlight. Oh my God! It was a dog, a golden retriever to be exact. She was lying half-buried in the snow, her body wrapped around something small and motionless. Puppies. Mark's chest tightened as he took in the scene. The mother dog looked up at him, her eyes filled with equal parts fear and desperation. She growled softly, a warning, but her trembling body gave away her exhaustion. Her fur was matted with ice, and her ribs were visible beneath her coat. "Easy girl," Mark said softly, crouching down to her level. He set his flashlight on the ground, letting the soft glow illuminate the heartbreaking sight in front of him. "I'm not going to hurt you." The golden retriever didn't move, her protective stance unwavering. But when Mark slowly extended his hand, she let out a weak whimper, her body sagging as if she no longer had the strength to hold herself up. Mark glanced at the puppies. 5 tiny, fragile forms huddled together beneath their mother. They barely moved, their tiny chests rising and falling with shallow breaths. "Jesus," he whispered. "How long have you been out here?" The mother dog didn't answer, of course, but her eyes seemed to plead with him. She nudged one of the puppies closer to him with her nose, as if to say, "Take them. Save them." Mark's hands shook as he unzipped his coat. He carefully wrapped the puppies in the thick fabric, his heart breaking at how light they felt, like little bundles of fur and bones. "You're a good girl," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done everything you could." Mark stood, cradling the puppies in his coat, and looked down at the golden retriever. She tried to stand, her legs wobbling beneath her, but she collapsed back into the snow. "No, no, no," Mark said quickly, kneeling beside her. "You're not giving up now. Come on." He wrapped his arms around her, lifting her as gently as he could. She was lighter than he expected, too light. She whimpered softly but didn't resist. Mark shifted her weight so he could carry her and the puppies, his body straining under the effort. "This is going to be a hell of a walk," he muttered, glancing at the tracks stretching out before him. The railway office wasn't far, maybe a mile or 2. But in this storm it might as well have been 20. The wind howled relentlessly as Mark trudged forward, each step a battle against the icy terrain. The golden retriever rested limply in his arms, her head pressed against his chest. Every so often, Mark would glance down to check on the puppies, making sure they were still breathing. "You're lucky I heard you," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf covering his face. "If I'd gone the other way, you wouldn't have made it." The dog didn't respond, of course, but her steady breathing gave Mark a glimmer of hope. Halfway to the office, Mark stumbled, his foot catching on a hidden rock beneath the snow. He fell to his knees, shielding the dogs with his body as he hit the ground. Pain shot through his leg, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself back up. "No time for that," he muttered, brushing the snow off his coat. The storm seemed determined to stop him, the wind growing fiercer with every passing minute. But Mark refused to slow down. He thought of the puppies, their tiny bodies so fragile in his coat, and of the mother dog, who had fought so hard to keep them alive. "They deserve a chance," he said aloud, as if trying to convince himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the faint outline of the railway office came into view. Mark's heart leapt, and he quickened his pace, his legs burning with the effort. When he reached the door, he kicked it open, stumbling inside and collapsing onto the floor. The warmth of the office was a shock to his system, and for a moment he just lay there, gasping for breath. The golden retriever stirred in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. Mark quickly sat up, laying her and the puppies on a pile of blankets he grabbed from the supply closet. "You're safe now," he said, his voice trembling. "I promise." He grabbed his radio and called for backup, his hands shaking as he relayed the situation. "I found a dog and her puppies on the tracks. They're in bad shape. I need a vet or at least someone who can help." As he waited for a response, Mark knelt beside the golden retriever, stroking her matted fur. Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw something other than fear in them. "Trust. You're a fighter," he said softly, "and I'm not going to let you down." Mark sat in the dimly lit railway office, his hands trembling as he cradled the radio. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault, howling like a pack of wild animals. The golden retriever lay curled on the pile of blankets he'd hastily thrown together, her body rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her puppies were tucked snugly inside his jacket, which he had lined with extra rags to keep them warm. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke into the radio, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "I need immediate assistance. I've got an injured dog and 5 puppies here. They're barely hanging on." Static crackled on the other end. For a moment, Mark thought no one would respond. Then, a voice broke through. "Mark, this is Charlie. The storm's causing interference. What's your location?" Mark leaned forward, gripping the radio tightly. I'm at the East Railway office, about a mile past the maintenance station. The road's completely snowed in. I don't think anyone can drive out here. Understood, Charlie replied. We'll try to send someone, but the storm's shutting everything down. Visibility is 0, and most of the roads are blocked. Can you hold out until morning? Mark glanced at the golden retriever, her eyes barely open as she rested on the blankets. The puppies squirmed faintly inside his jacket, their tiny cries muffled but persistent. Morning? They didn't have until morning. No, Mark said firmly. They won't last that long. I need help now or they're not going to make it. There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Finally, Charlie's voice came back, quieter this time. We'll do what we can. Hang tight, Mark. Mark set the radio down, frustration bubbling in his chest. Hang tight, he muttered under his breath. Easier said than done. He turned his attention back to the mother dog. She lifted her head weakly as he approached, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. You've been through hell, haven't you, girl? Mark said softly, crouching beside her. He stroked her head gently, his fingers brushing against her ice-crusted fur. Don't worry. I'm not letting anything happen to you or your babies. Lucy, though Mark didn't yet know her name, let out a faint whimper, leaning into his touch. It was as if she understood him, as if she knew he was her last hope. Mark stood, scanning the small office. It wasn't much. A desk, a few chairs, and some basic supplies. A kerosene heater sat in the corner, barely managing to take the edge off the cold. He grabbed it and brought it closer to the blankets, adjusting the flame to give off more heat. Let's get you warmed up, he said, glancing at the thermometer on the wall. It read 10 degrees Fahrenheit minus 12 degrees Celsius and was still dropping. He rummaged through the supply closet, pulling out an old first aid kit. It wasn't designed for animals, but it was all he had. He cleaned Lucy's paws as best he could, wincing at the sight of the raw, bleeding pads. She flinched but didn't pull away, too weak to resist. You're a tough one, Mark murmured, his voice filled with admiration. I can see it in your eyes. You've been fighting for them this whole time. Hours passed, the storm outside showing no signs of easing. Mark kept himself busy, checking on the puppies every few minutes. They were still weak but alive, their tiny bodies nestled together in a cocoon of warmth. Lucy seemed to draw strength from knowing her puppies were safe. She lifted her head more often now, her ears perking up whenever one of them let out a tiny squeak. You're not giving up, are you? Mark said with a small smile. I knew you had it in you. He sat beside her, his back against the wall, and sighed. The weight of the situation pressed down on him like the snow piling up outside. He thought about the conversation he'd had with Charlie. If no one could get through the storm, it was up to him to keep them alive until morning. But how? Mark's mind raced as he considered his options. The nearest vet clinic was over 10 miles away, too far to walk in this weather, especially with 5 puppies and an injured dog. The railway office had a snowmobile, but it was low on fuel, and the storm made the route treacherous. Still, it might be their only chance. Mark stood, pacing the small room. He couldn't just sit here and wait. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to losing them. All right, he said aloud, his voice steady with determination. Here's the plan. He turned to Lucy, who was watching him intently now, as if sensing his resolve. We're getting you out of here, he said. All of you. He grabbed his jacket and slipped it back on, carefully transferring the puppies to a small insulated bag he found in the closet. He lined it with rags and placed it close to his chest, securing it with the strap so they'd stay warm. Lucy let out a low whine as he prepared to lift her. I know, Mark said gently, but you're going to have to trust me. I can't carry you and the puppies unless you let me help. She hesitated, her body tensing. But then she relaxed, her trust in him outweighing her fear. Mark wrapped her in a thick blanket, securing it tightly around her body. Then, with a deep breath, he lifted her into his arms. She was heavier than the puppies but still too light for a dog her size. You ready, girl? Mark asked, his voice soft but firm. Let's go. The snowmobile was parked in a shed behind the office, its engine half buried in snow. Mark set Lucy and the puppies down inside the shed while he worked to clear the snow and get the machine running. It took longer than he'd hoped, the cold sapping his strength, but finally, the engine roared to life. "All right," he said, turning back to the small family. "Time to get moving." He secured Lucy and the puppies on the snowmobile, wrapping them in extra blankets and strapping them in tightly. Then he climbed on, gripping the handlebars with frozen fingers. The wind hit him like a wall as soon as he left the shed, but he didn't slow down. The snowmobile cut through the drifts, its engine straining against the storm. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The road was barely visible, the headlights doing little to penetrate the swirling snow. He gritted his teeth, his focus unwavering. He had to make it. After what felt like an eternity, the faint glow of lights appeared on the horizon. The vet clinic. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he pushed the snowmobile harder, the engine roaring in protest. "Hang on," he said, glancing back at Lucy. "We're almost there." The clinic doors burst open as Mark stumbled inside, cradling Lucy in one arm and the bag of puppies in the other. "I need help," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "They're freezing." The vet and her assistants rushed forward, their faces a mix of shock and urgency. "We'll take it from here," the vet said, guiding Mark to a table where he gently laid Lucy down. Mark stepped back, his body sagging with exhaustion. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to hope. The sterile white walls of the vet clinic seemed like an entirely different world compared to the icy chaos Mark had battled just minutes ago. The blizzard raged outside, but inside, a team of professionals worked in hurried silence, their hands moving with practiced precision. Mark stood by the door, his legs barely supporting him, watching as the vet and her assistants assessed the condition of Lucy and her puppies. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to catch his breath, still feeling the sting of the freezing wind on his face. "All right, let's move quickly," Dr. Harris, the lead vet, said in a calm but commanding voice. She was a tall woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "The puppies are hypothermic. We'll need warm fluids, heating pads, and oxygen for the weakest ones. And the mother, she's severely dehydrated and malnourished. Let's get N4 started." Mark took a shaky step forward. Are they going to make it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Dr. Harris glanced at him briefly, her expression softening. "We'll do everything we can. But they've been through a lot, and the next few hours are critical." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only added to the weight pressing down on his chest. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. He couldn't bear the thought of losing them, not after everything they'd been through together. The room buzzed with activity as the staff got to work. The puppies were placed in an incubator lined with soft, warm towels. Tiny oxygen masks were fitted over their fragile faces, and their shallow breaths began to even out as the warmth seeped into their tiny bodies. Lucy, meanwhile, lay motionless on the examination table, and 4-line ran into her front leg, delivering fluids and nutrients her body so desperately needed. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes fluttered open every so often, scanning the room for her puppies. "She's still alert," Dr. Harris noted, placing a hand gently on Lucy's head. "That's a good sign. She's fighting." Mark moved closer, his boots squeaking on the polished floor. He knelt beside the table and reached out, his hand hovering over Lucy's fur. "You're doing great, girl," he whispered. "Just hang in there a little longer. They need you." Lucy's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. She let out a soft whimper and weakly licked his hand, a gesture so small yet so full of trust that it nearly broke Mark's heart. Hours passed, the storm outside battering the building but failing to disturb the fragile sanctuary within. Mark refused to leave Lucy's side, even as exhaustion clawed at him. He sat on the floor beside the table, his head resting against the edge, his eyes fixed on her face. Dr. Harris checked on them periodically, her expression a mix of concern and cautious optimism. "She's stable for now," she told Mark during one of her rounds, "but she'll need time to recover." And the puppies? They're responding well to the warmth and oxygen, but they're not out of the woods yet. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you for everything. The vet offered him a small smile. You did the hard part, bringing them here in this storm. Most people wouldn't have taken that risk. Mark shook his head. I couldn't just leave them. They deserved a chance. As the night wore on, the clinic grew quiet. The frantic pace of the rescue had slowed, replaced by the steady hum of machines and the soft breathing of the animals. Mark finally allowed himself to lean back against the wall, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He thought about the moment he'd found Lucy and her puppies on the tracks, huddled together in the freezing cold. He thought about the desperation in Lucy's eyes, the unrelenting will to protect her babies despite the odds stacked against her. You're a hero, you know that? Mark said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the incubator. You kept them alive when anyone else would have given up. You're amazing, Lucy. Lucy's ears twitched again, and she let out a soft sigh, her body finally relaxing as if she knew she was safe now. The first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting a pale light over the clinic. The blizzard had finally begun to die down, leaving a blanket of snow so deep it covered the surrounding cars and buildings. Mark was still sitting beside Lucy's table when Dr. Harris entered the room, a clipboard in hand. She looked tired but hopeful. They're doing well, she said, giving Mark a reassuring smile. The puppies are stable, and Lucy's responding to the fluids. I think they're going to pull through. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, so overwhelming that it brought tears to his eyes. He wiped them away quickly, hoping no one would notice. That's the best news I've heard in a long time, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Harris nodded. They're lucky you found them when you did. Another hour out there, and they wouldn't have made it. Mark glanced at Lucy, who was now resting peacefully, her breathing slow but steady. He reached out and gently stroked her fur. I think I'm the lucky one, he said quietly. By mid-morning, the storm had cleared enough for the roads to reopen. Mark stepped outside to get some air, the crisp morning sun reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. The world was quiet, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. He took a deep breath, his lungs filling with the cold, clean air. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a sense of peace. When he returned to the clinic, Dr. Harris was waiting for him. We've contacted the local shelter, she said. They're prepared to take Lucy and the puppies once they're ready. But if you're interested, they'll need a foster home. Mark blinked, caught off guard. You mean me? Dr. Harris shrugged. You've already proven you're willing to go to great lengths for them. And it seems like Lucy trusts you. Think about it. Mark looked over at Lucy and the incubator holding her puppies. They were still so small, so fragile, but they were fighters, just like their mother. I don't need to think about it, he said, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'll take them. The next few days passed in a blur of activity, exhaustion, and relief. The once dire situation had stabilized, and Lucy and her puppies were showing steady signs of improvement. The puppies, though still small and fragile, were eating regularly now, their tiny cries filling the clinic with a hopeful energy. Lucy had regained enough strength to lift her head and watch over her little ones, her eyes brimming with love and determination. Mark visited the clinic every day, making the hour-long trip through icy roads without hesitation. It was as if a bond had formed between him and the little family, a bond he couldn't explain but felt deeply in his heart. Every time he stepped into the clinic, Lucy's tail would give a faint wag, her eyes lighting up as she recognized him. Dr. Harris noticed the change, too. She's attached to you, she said one morning as Mark crouched beside Lucy's bed, stroking her golden fur. She's incredible, Mark replied, his voice filled with admiration. The way she fought for her puppies. She's the real hero, Dr. Harris smiled. And now she needs a hero of her own. Have you thought about what I said? About fostering them? Mark hesitated. He had thought about it, every waking moment since she'd suggested it. But the idea of taking on such a responsibility felt daunting. His life was already a mess. He wasn't sure he was capable of caring for 6 lives that depended on him. "I don't know," he admitted. "What if I screw it up? What if I can't give them what they need?" Dr. Harris placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You already have," she said simply. "You saved their lives. You gave them a chance. That's more than most people would have done." Later that evening, Mark found himself sitting in his truck outside the clinic, staring at the softly glowing windows. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, covering the world in a quiet stillness. He thought about Lucy and her puppies, about the way they'd clung to life against impossible odds. He thought about the moment he'd found them on the tracks, huddled together for warmth, and how Lucy had looked at him with such trust, even in the face of fear. He couldn't walk away. The next morning, Mark arrived at the clinic with a decision. "I'll take them," he told Dr. Harris, his voice steady but nervous. "All of them, at least until they're ready for adoption." Dr. Harris beamed. "I had a feeling you'd say that." The process of preparing Lucy and her puppies for their new home took a few more days. Dr. Harris gave Mark a crash course in animal care, teaching him everything from bottle feeding the puppies to managing Lucy's diet and recovery. "You're going to be fine," she assured him as she handed over a bag of supplies. "They're lucky to have you." Mark wasn't so sure about that, but he packed up the supplies and loaded Lucy and the puppies into his truck with as much care as he could muster. Lucy seemed calm, her tail wagging faintly as she settled into the back seat with her babies. As he drove home, the weight of his decision began to sink in. His small cabin in the woods wasn't exactly set up for a family of 6 dogs. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Lucy resting peacefully with her puppies, he knew he'd made the right choice. Mark's cabin was modest but warm, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. He carried Lucy and the puppies inside, setting up a cozy corner with blankets and heating pads. Lucy inspected the space carefully before lying down, her puppies quickly curling up beside her. "You're home now," Mark said softly, crouching beside them. "It's not much, but it's yours." For the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel so empty. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Caring for 5 energetic puppies and their recovering mother was no small task. Mark found himself waking up in the middle of the night to feed the puppies or check on Lucy. His once quiet cabin was now filled with the sounds of tiny paws scampering across the floor and the occasional playful bark. Despite the chaos, Mark felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in a long time. The routine of caring for Lucy and her puppies gave his day structure, and their unconditional trust and affection filled a void he hadn't realized was there. Lucy, too, seemed to thrive in her new environment. Her fur grew thick and shiny again, and her eyes regained their spark. She spent her days watching over her puppies, her tail wagging as they tumbled around the cabin. One evening, as Mark sat by the fireplace, Lucy came over and rested her head on his lap. He scratched behind her ears, smiling down at her. "You're a good mom," he said softly. "You've done an amazing job." Lucy looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. It was as if she understood every word he said. Mark leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the fire wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, he felt content. He glanced at the puppies, who were now curled up together in a pile of blankets, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. They were safe. They were home. And so was he. Weeks turned into months, and winter slowly loosened its icy grip on the world. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of green beneath the frost. In Mark's small cabin, life had settled into a new rhythm, one that revolved around Lucy and her growing puppies. The once fragile litter was now a bundle of energy, tumbling over one another, chasing shadows, and filling the cabin with joyous chaos. Each puppy had its own personality. One was adventurous and always wandered too far. Another was timid and clung to Lucy's side. Mark had named them all, though he knew deep down that naming them would only make it harder to let them go when the time came. Lucy, ever the attentive mother, kept a watchful eye on her pups but also began to relax. She had regained her strength, and her golden coat now gleamed in the sunlight that streamed through the cabin windows. She followed Mark everywhere, her loyalty unwavering, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. One bright morning, Mark sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. Lucy lay at his feet, her head resting on his boots, while the puppies explored the yard. The world felt peaceful, the crisp mountain air filled with the sounds of birdsong and the distant rustle of leaves. As he watched the puppies wrestle with a stick twice their size, Mark's mind wandered back to the moment he'd found them on the tracks. The desperation in Lucy's eyes, the icy wind cutting through his jacket. It all felt like a lifetime ago. "They've come so far," he said aloud, scratching Lucy behind her ears. "And so have you." Lucy let out a contented sigh, as if agreeing with him. A few days later, Mark received a call from the local shelter. They had found families for 3 of the puppies, families who were eager to welcome them into loving homes. Mark's heart sank at the thought of saying goodbye, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The day the families arrived, Mark felt a mix of pride and sadness. He knelt beside the pups, giving each one a gentle hug. "You're going to have amazing lives," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Be good, and don't forget where you came from." Lucy watched from the porch, her ears perked and her tail wagging faintly. She seemed to understand that her babies were going to good homes. After the last puppy was handed off, Mark sat on the steps beside Lucy, the two of them watching the cars disappear down the dirt road. The cabin felt quieter now, but it wasn't empty. "You still have me," Mark said, smiling down at her. Lucy nudged his hand with her nose, as if to say, "And you have me." The weeks that followed brought more changes. Lucy and the remaining 2 puppies grew closer to Mark, filling the void left by their siblings. The small family settled into a routine, one that was peaceful and fulfilling. Mark's cabin, once a solitary retreat, had become a home. He found himself smiling more, laughing at the puppies' antics, and feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Lucy curled up at his side, Mark reflected on how much his life had changed. He realized that rescuing Lucy and her pups hadn't just saved them. It had saved him, too. Months later, Mark took Lucy and the 2 puppies, now almost fully grown, for a walk along the tracks where it all began. The snow had melted, revealing wildflowers that swayed in the breeze. The once desolate place now felt alive, a symbol of new beginnings. Mark crouched beside Lucy, wrapping an arm around her. "We've come full circle, haven't we?" he said, his voice soft. Lucy licked his face, her tail wagging furiously. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. They had found each other in the coldest, darkest moment of their lives. And together, they had found warmth, hope, and a future worth living for. If you were moved by this story of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's spread hope and inspire others to help those in need, because every life, no matter how small, deserves a second chance. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.